Okay, well, I feel like I'm kind of on a roll, so let's continue. We're talking about next about imperialism, and what we're talking about is Western imperialism. Now, again, let's define some terms, right? Imperialism is not the monopoly of Western culture. Imperialism has existed, again, throughout human history. The first civilization in human history of the Sumerians, and the first period of Sumerian history is known as the Proto-Imperial period. It's the time in which they expanded and conquered their neighbors. Imperialism means that you conquer, control other people. Now, there are some terms, so let's define them, all right? Imperialism, the conquest or the controlling of another people. There are many forms of imperialism. There's simply the military conquest. We, the United States, were always accused of being economic imperialists. We come in, we control your economy, and therefore we control you. There is the word colonization, or colonies. Colonization is when you actually occupy another people's territory. You take over their land. Okay? If you are a colonist, you're an imperialist. If you're an imperialist, you're not necessarily a colonist. Right? You don't have to control land in order to be an imperialist. Many cultures have been imperialist. We are talking about modern Western European imperialism. There are two basic periods for this. There's the First Empire, and that's when the Europeans moved into the Americas, started in the 16th century, and that ends around 1820s, 1830s. And by that time period, most of the colonies have won their independence. They broken away from their mother countries. There are exceptions. Canada's still closely tied to Britain. There are places in South America that are still connected to the European countries, but most, the United States, Mexico, major countries in South America have broken away in their independence. We're not going to be talking about the First Empire. What we're going to be talking about is the Second Empire. The Second Empire is when Europeans began to move into Africa. From Africa, they moved to Asia, and India, and then Asia, or Far East. This begins in the late 19th century. So we're going to start this off with Africa. Let's talk about Europeans moving into Africa. There are a couple of fallacies about Europeans moving into Africa. One fallacy is that Europeans moved into Africa and Africans, after maybe some initial kind of resistance, simply gave up and said, we can't possibly stand up against the great power of the white people. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Africans resisted yearly. There were revolts and revolutions throughout Africa almost on a yearly basis. It took a very large military police type state to control Africa through the 19th and early 20th century. Europeans did so because they thought it would be profitable. They thought they would make money out of this, and they did it for pride. They did that for nationalism. There are a lot of different reasons for European imperialism, but Africa certainly did resist. The other fallacy is they were there for a long time, which is not true. Europeans were there for, well, in some places no more than 50, 75 years, some other places maybe as long as 100, but certainly not as long as many people think. It was long enough to screw up a lot of things. For instance, even though Africa has won its independence, most of Africa since the 1960s, there are 52 states in Africa, and only 2 of them have independent boundaries drawn up by themselves. Most of the African states, they have boundaries that are colonial boundaries. They're boundaries that don't make any sense. They're boundaries that are going to cause friction and problems. When people look at modern African history, one of the things I think they should be amazed at is how little violence there has been when you consider how badly organized these states were. We'll get to that later on in the 20th century. Point is this. In the early part of the 19th century, as Europeans began to move further into Africa, they found immediately resistance, not just by Africans, but by Africa itself. As I said earlier, life expectancy for Europeans going into the tropics was about 6 weeks. The primary thing that would kill you was malaria. Malaria killed off thousands of whites who moved into Africa. But in the 1860s, a guy named Dr. Baiki, B-A-I-K-I-E, discovered the use of quinine. Quinine, which helps you resist malaria. It doesn't keep you from getting malaria, but you simply don't get sick from malaria. So the favorite drink for colonists in tropical Africa was gin and tonic, because there was they would say this is their medicine because there was quinine in it. And the quinine is in the tonic, it's not in the gin. I guess they figured there's no point in just drinking tonic, so they would mix it with the gin and say, this is my medicine to fight malaria. Get drunk off their butts on their porches. But nonetheless, point being that it wasn't until the late 19th century that Europeans found the means to begin to move comfortably into the interior of Africa. But they did so quickly. 1860s, 1870s, they were moving quickly, carving out territory, signing treaties with chiefs that made no sense whatsoever, especially to the chiefs. It was such a chaotic situation that the Europeans began to fear that if we're just going head on into Africa, we're going to head into each other, and we might create a conflict that could end up with a major war in Europe, and we don't want that. Right? We want things to go nicely. We want to make money off of this. So in 1884, they decided to have a great conference, a conference where they would divide up Africa. And the first idea was we'll just set the rules. And they just set the rules. Make sure nobody gets into each way, steps on each other's toes. So major representatives came to Berlin, the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, to decide what the rules were going to be. But as they sat there discussing the rules, they came to the conclusion, you know what? We don't need to just set up the rules. Let's just carve up Africa here. Now, none of these guys ever been to Africa. The maps were not very good, but nonetheless, they began to trade off territory. The British, the French, and eventually the Belgians, the Portuguese, and they each had their own colors, like a great game of Risk. They each had their own color, and the British was red, and the French was blue. And so as they carved out the map of Africa, they could see how much land they had by where the color was. This also became an issue of national pride as the new nations of the 19th century developing, nations like Germany and Italy, and even the older countries like Britain and France, owning colonies became national and became a sense of pride. But of course, the main reason they moved into Africa was economics. Although it's argued that they made very little profit out of going into Africa, they always told their general population that we are going to Africa to make money. It's going to be profitable. After the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, Africa began to be divided up amongst the Europeans. However, they don't really begin to take control until the early 20th century. Early 20th century when they begin to actually establish themselves in these African societies. We'll get to that later. But this is by the end of the 19th century, they moved into Africa, and now their organization, their weapons, their firearms, give them advantage over the divided Africans with their less technology. Let's move to India. Now, there are two major civilizations throughout human history that, generally speaking, there are exceptions, some time periods, but generally except, if you're looking to have the most advanced societies of that age throughout most of human history, best technology, probably the best standard of living for the longest consistent period of time, those two societies are usually China or India. Yes, we got the Greeks for a little while, the Romans maybe for a couple of months, but not very long. Right? These are not places you want to live for very long. But China, India, usually right up there, one or two on most of these standard of living kind of priorities. India, one of the oldest civilizations in human history, the Indus civilization goes back to 2500 BC, had many great empires, amongst the most important being the Magyar Empire. In the 17th century, India politically began to divide. And that, Magyar, the Mughal Empire, M-U-G-H-A-L, Mughal Empire. As the Mughal Empire began to go in decline, the India began to break up into small principalities and states. And the Europeans saw an opportunity. Between 1756 and 1756 to 1763, we have something called the 7 Years' War, or in North America called the French and Indian War. This is a war fought between Britain and France over who would be allowed to exploit North America and India. Whoever lost had to leave these two places. Whoever won had a free hand. Britain won the 7 Years' War, and so they were able to exploit both North America and India. Now, when it came to North America, that really wasn't much of a problem. Right? North America, you had Native Americans, low technology, sparsely populated. The British could move westward, and they did so. But in India, you had a whole different story here. India had large communities, organized communities, good technology. So going into India was not a sure thing. So the British government decided that what they would do is they would use a chartered company, the British East India Company, set them up in India, back them, and if they made money, the British would make money through taxes. And if they failed, which is a very good chance they might, the British East India Company wouldn't cost the British government anything. So the British East India Company went into India, and they began to trade, do business, and they began to exploit situations where they could. The great leader and hero, if you want to call him that, of the British East India Company this time is a man named Robert Clive. I say if you want to call him that, Robert Clive was a criminal. In England, he would have been in prison. But in India, his criminal skills came in very, very handy. He was cold, he was cutthroat, he used torture, he used whatever maneuver he could, and he was able to carve out a large amount of India and put it under British East India control, put it under the company's control. This occurred primarily because Robert Clive and the British East India Company created the best army in the world. This was the British East India Company Army. The army, well into the 19th century, was manned primarily by Indians. They are called sepoys, S-E-P-O-Y, sepoys. The rank and file soldiers were sepoys, Indians. The officers were all British officers, usually British officers from the British military who were on leave or had retired, and they would go work for the British East India Company. Sepoys were well trained, they were well supplied, and they were well paid. And the British East India Company was smart in that they made sure that wherever you as a sepoy were stationed was far away from where you actually lived. So if you were from southern India, you were stationed in the north, or east India, you were stationed in the west. So far away, so you weren't actually controlling your own people. This worked for quite a while, and the British East India Company made a lot of money. But in 1857, you had something called the Sepoy Mutiny. The sepoys rebelled. Why they rebelled is still open to some debate. People are still writing books about this. It could have been a religious issue. Most of the sepoys would have been Hindu. The officers were Christian, and they believed there may have been some conflict there. It may have been an issue of nationalism. Simply the sepoys, or many of them, had finally come to the conclusion that they were being used. It's possible. Again, I said there are articles out there written about this, and there's some good books on it if you want to look it up. But in 1857, the sepoys mutinied. The British government sent in the regular British army, and they were able to put down the sepoy mutiny. They arrested all the leaders. They took the leaders, and while the sepoys were forced to stand at attention, they took the leaders of the mutiny, tied them face first to cannons, and lit them, blew them to pieces in front of them. The idea being, of course, that this will teach you. That didn't teach anything. The Sepoy Mutiny is really the beginnings of the Indian nationalist movement. We know by the 1930s, you'll have Gandhi who will be leading the nationalist movement, eventually Indian independence. But without the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, there would have been no Gandhi. So that's really the roots of Indian independence. Let's move further east. We move further east, guys. Most of Asia, certainly by the 19th century, had been taken control or controlled, conquered in one way or another by Westerners, and this includes the United States. So let's start off with Indochina. By the middle 19th century, Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia were all controlled by the French. These were all French colonies. Be aware of this, guys. It's easy for exams because I may ask you things like who controlled what colony. You had colonies, places like Burma, which were controlled by the British. You had a rather unique place called Siam, today we call Thailand, which unique in that it was never actually officially colonized. It was never a colony of any particular nation, but the British did control their economy and their military, and it really was indirectly a British colony. Siam or Thailand. Before we get to China, let's talk about another country very quickly, an Asian country. Way back in 1632, Japan had closed itself off to the world. It said, we are now going to become an isolationist nation. We'll get back to Japan in a moment here, guys.